Stop scrolling because one of your favorite 1970s soul legends made an album so bad, most fans pretend it never happened. And I'm not talking about mid. I mean albums that sounded rushed, confused, or like they were chasing trends instead of making magic. Here's the crazy part. One album on this list came from an artist you would never expect, and it might shock you more than number one. Picture you and me late at night, lights low, you put on a classic 70s R&B album, ready for chills, and then skip, nothing hits.
When I go away, I know my heart.
If you don't know these albums, you'll keep wasting time on must-hear lists that don't tell the full truth, and you'll miss the real gems that actually deserve your ears. So in this countdown, I'm naming 12 worst R&B/soul albums of the 1970s, and I'm telling you exactly why each one fell off, so you never get tricked again. 12. The Temptations, 1990. Picture this, it's 1973. You're sitting in your living room, lights low, record spinning, expecting that smooth Temptations magic. But instead of grooves that pull you in, the music feels heavy, cloudy, and hard to follow.
Love has come my way. So nice to be in.
Like the band is talking at you, not to you. It sounds serious, but not always soulful. This album was produced mainly by Norman Whitfield, released on Gordy/Motown during the peak of the psychedelic soul era.
Love out there these days. I got no about.
The title 1990 wasn't about the future sounding fun. It was about fear, control, politics, and where the world was headed. The lyrics touch on social issues, government power, and confusion in America.
Tough out there these days. I got no.
But the songs often stretch too long and lose focus. While it charted modestly, it didn't produce a lasting hit and is rarely mentioned when people talk about the Temptations' greatest work.
Girl, you make me feel good, so special.
Fun fact, the album was meant to feel like a movie or prophecy, almost like Norman Whitfield was scoring a warning film about the future. Some band members later hinted they felt the concept was pushed too hard, with not enough room for Natural Temptations' harmony magic.
Back on the right track, think about you constantly, and I know
Why it's forgotten/disappointing. This album came out when fans still wanted songs they could feel, not lectures they had to decode. The Temptations were already dealing with lineup changes, and the long, heavy tracks made it hard for casual listeners to connect. Real fans respect it, but most don't replay it. This is one of those albums heads remember once, then quietly slide back into the shelf. And the next album? Same decade, but the fall feels even louder when the joy disappeared. Number 11, Sly and the Family Stone, Heard You Missed Me, Well I'm Back, 1976. Now listen, that title already tells you the story before the needle even drops. This album feels like walking into a party after everybody already left. The room is quiet, the lights are low, and you can still smell the funk. But the energy that used to shake the walls is gone. It sounds lonely, scattered, and tired, like a genius trying to remember who he used to be. The album dropped in 1976 on Epic Records, after Sly Stone had already scared off bandmates, labels, and radio with years of missed shows and chaos. Most of the original Family Stone lineup was gone, replaced with new players who never fully locked in the old magic. Lyrically, Sly talks about regret, ego, confusion, and trying to reclaim love and respect. But the songs feel unfinished and uneven. Critics at the time and even later called it a clear step down from the run that changed funk and soul forever. Fun fact, a lot of fans didn't even realize this was supposed to be a comeback album. The title sounds confident, but many listeners said it felt more like Sly saying, "I'm back," while still half missing. Why it's forgotten / disappointing. This album gets forgotten because it came after too much damage was already done. No real hits, no big radio moments, and no unity in the band. Just flashes of what used to be there. Real heads don't play this one for joy. They play it to understand how even legends can fall apart. This isn't a bad album because it's trash. It's bad because it reminds you of how high Sly once flew. And keep listening, because the next album on this list proves that even perfect voices can't save weak direction. Number 10, Motown or Soul Giants commercial misfires. This was supposed to be a big moment. Instead, it confused a lot of people. Picture a late night radio in Detroit. You're expecting smooth harmonies, love songs, and that classic Temptations magic, but what comes out feels heavy, slow, and cloudy. It's soul music wearing a serious face, but forgetting how to smile. This album was produced by Norman Whitfield and released on Motown Records in 1973, during the Temptations' experimental era. The songs talked about war, money, politics, and the future, not love or heartbreak like fans expected. Motown pushed it as a bold, grown-up album, but it didn't sell well and never came close to their classic run. Many fans didn't know how to feel, and radio barely touched it. Fun fact, Motown hoped 1990 would make the Temptations sound modern and serious, but some DJs quietly stopped playing it because listeners kept calling to change the song. Why it's forgotten / underrated. This album got lost because it sat between two worlds, too deep for pop fans, too stiff for soul lovers. It was also overshadowed by the group's legendary earlier hits, which made this one feel even colder by comparison. Real heads remember it, but most people skip it without knowing why. And the next album, bigger name, louder disappointment, and a fall nobody saw coming. Number 9, R&B LPs with bubblegum soul syndrome, mid to late 1970s. This is soul with the teeth taken out. Picture bright smiles, hand claps, and lyrics that sound cute, but say nothing. You're in a record shop listening booth, hoping for chills, and all you get is a sugar rush that fades before the song ends. In the mid to late 1970s, some R&B labels started pushing artists toward bubblegum soul. Simple hooks, kiddie-friendly lyrics, and glossy production meant to chase pop radio. These albums were often made fast, produced by label-approved teams, and aimed at teen markets instead of grown listeners. The lyrics focused on surface-level love, no struggle, no spirit, no real life. Some records charted briefly, but many disappeared fast because they didn't age well and weren't built for deep listening. Fun fact, some of these albums were recorded in just a few days using leftover studio time because labels wanted something quick to compete with pop and disco releases already climbing the charts. Why it's forgotten / overrated. These albums faded because soul fans could hear the compromise. They came out in a decade where Marvin, Curtis, Stevie, and Donnie were speaking truth, and bubblegum soul felt fake by comparison. No depth means no replay value. Real heads don't dig for these. They skip past them. This is the kind of soul record you remember the hook, but forget the feeling. Remember when I teased that labels were changing soul from the inside? This is where it really shows. Some artists later said in interviews that they were pushed into lighter, pop-leaning material to stay marketable. Others never spoke publicly, but fans noticed the shift immediately. It wasn't about talent, it was about control. Labels wanted crossover hits, radio safety, and fast money. The result, albums that sold okay in the moment, but damaged credibility and quietly stalled careers. That's why these records aren't just forgettable music. They're proof of what happens when soul stops telling the truth. In the next entry, same decade, but now the disappointment comes from a legend, not a trend.
Go, and I should know.
Number 8, various indie R&B acts, trying to make it on my own. No big name, no big label, just hope, talent, and not enough help. Picture a small studio with one mic, dusty carpets, and a band that practiced in a garage after work. The singer is pouring their heart out, real pain, real love, but the sound is thin, the drums are weak, and the mix feels like it's trapped behind a wall.
To do it all alone.
You hear the soul, but it never fully lands. In the 1970s, hundreds of R&B artists recorded albums on tiny independent labels, sometimes self-funded, sometimes backed by local businessmen, churches, or community studios. These records were usually about everyday life, heartbreak, faith, working class struggle, and holding on when nobody is watching.
I don't care if I'm right or wrong. I'll live my
But without strong producers, proper studios, or national distribution, many of these albums sounded unfinished. Off-key harmonies, muddy bass, weak pressing quality. Most never charted, never crossed state lines, and were gone from stores in months.
do it on my own. Yeah.
Fun fact, some of these albums were pressed in runs as small as 300 to 500 copies. If the local radio DJ didn't play it, the record basically disappeared forever, even if the singer was incredible.
To living through your eyes, too many lies.
Why it's forgotten / why it's called bad. This is the hard truth. Not every forgotten album is a hidden gem. A lot of these indie R&B LPs had big hearts but small resources, and listeners judged them by sound, not intentions. They faded because the majors were dropping classics at the same time, and history doesn't wait for records that sound rough, no matter how honest they are. Real heads respect the struggle, but they don't replay every record.
And if you don't know by now,
And keep listening, because number 7 is where even a true genius couldn't escape bad choices and lost his grip on the magic.
Ain't got the time for nobody but you and I.
Number 7, Shalimar, Big Fun. 1979, picture a shiny dance floor in 79, mirror ball spinning, everybody dressed sharp. The beat comes on and it's fun. No doubt, but it feels plastic, like smiling for a photo that never ends.
A good thing, 'cause temptation lost a hold on me.
You're moving, but your heart isn't. Big Fun came out in 1979 on Solar Records, produced by Leon Silvers III, right when disco was everywhere and labels wanted movement first, feeling later. The songs are about partying, good times, and dancing all night. Nothing deep, nothing wrong, just nothing risky.
'Cause all that I've been through tells me that I'm right for you.
The title track did well and kept Shalimar visible, but the album leaned hard into the formula instead of growth. Compared to what R&B was becoming, more emotional, more personal, this felt like staying in the shallow end.
Time for us and nobody else. It's my love.
Fun fact, Shalimar started as a dance group tied to the TV show Soul Train. So movement was always part of their DNA. That's why this album feels choreographed. Even when you're just listening, you can almost see the steps.
It's the right time for us. Got me all to yourself.
Why It's Forgotten / why people call it bad. The problem isn't that Big Fun is unlistenable, it's that it plays it too safe. Disco was changing fast, and R&B fans were starting to want songs that hit the heart, not just the feet.
To yourself, so do what you wanna do.
When Shalimar later leaned more into smoother, more emotional records, this album got left behind. It's not hated, it's just quietly skipped. And keep listening, because number 6 is where polish turns into pressure and the soul really starts slipping through the cracks.
Broke into my mind. She's a burglar.
Number 6, Howard Tate, She's a Burglar. Picture this, late night, radio low, rain tapping the window. You're expecting that raw, crying soul Howard Tate was famous for, but instead, the record feels polite, dressed up, almost holding back his tears. It's like seeing a street preacher put in a suit and told to behave.
She's a burglar.
This album dropped in 1972 on Atlantic Records after Howard Tate had already made his name in the late 60s with deep, painful soul records produced by Jerry Ragavoy. Those earlier songs were about real heartbreak, real struggle, real hunger, and people felt every word. By the early 70s, soul music was changing fast.
I was standing helpless, lost my mind.
Funk was getting heavier, singers were getting freer, and labels wanted cleaner, smoother sounds. This self-titled album still has Tate's powerful voice, but the material leans more safe and controlled, and the emotion doesn't always hit like before. The album didn't make a big chart impact, and it quietly slipped past most listeners while louder, bolder soul records took over the moment.
Took all the things she could find.
Fun fact, Howard Tate's voice was so respected that even when his career slowed down, musicians and collectors never forgot him. His older songs were later sampled, covered, and rediscovered by crate diggers decades after this album faded.
Took all the things she could find. She's a burglar.
Why It's Forgotten / why it ends up on a worst list. This one hurts because the problem isn't talent, it's timing and direction. Compared to his late 60s classics, this album feels like a man being asked to tone down his pain just when soul music was starting to scream the truth louder than ever. So it got overshadowed, quietly shelved, and rarely reissued or talked about.
Took all the things she could find.
Real heads know Howard Tate was special, but this album feels like a missed moment, not a full statement. Stay with me, because number 5 is where the label pressure gets even heavier, and you can actually hear the industry pulling the artist away from their roots.
When I go away, I know my heart can stay with me.
Number 5, Paul McCartney and Wings, My Love. Picture you riding in a late night taxi, radio low, city lights sliding by. My Love comes on and it feels soft, sweet, almost sleepy, pretty on the ears, but not heavy on the heart.
Where was my love?
You're waiting for soul to grab you, but it just kind of floats past. Red Rose Speedway came out in 1973 on Apple Records, produced by Paul McCartney during the early Wings era when he was still proving himself after the Beatles. The album was meant to be a big, loose double LP, but the label pushed it down to a single album, and you can hear that confusion in the track list.
When the cupboard's bare, I'll still find something.
Lyrically, most songs stay light. Love, good feelings, playful moments, nothing wrong with that, but very little real-life weight. Commercially, it did well. It hit number 1 in the US, mostly off My Love, but critics even then called the album uneven and padded. For R&B and soul listeners in the 70s, when Marvin, Curtis, Stevie, and Philly soul were cutting deep, this record felt polite, not personal. Fun fact, the album was originally planned as a wild double set with jams and experiments, but when it got cut down, the leftovers were shelved, so what you hear is basically the safe version, not the risky one Paul first imagined.
My love, it's understood.
Why it's forgotten / why it gets called bad. This album didn't age badly, it just didn't age loudly. It got overshadowed by better Wings albums and by much deeper soul records from the same year. For R&B fans, it sits in that awkward space, too soft to groove to, too shallow to feel, too polished to sweat.
My love does it good.
Real heads don't hate it, they just don't reach for it when they need soul. Remember when I said some albums weren't bad because of talent, but because of industry choices? This one is a perfect example. Label pressure-trimmed creativity, pushed safety, and turned a risky idea into a polite product.
Oh, my love. Oh, my love.
That's why Red Rose Speedway isn't just an album. It's a lesson in how playing it safe can quietly kill the soul, and keep listening. Because number 4 is where good intentions, industry pressure, and real controversy finally crash into each other. Number 4, Miles Davis, On the Corner. This doesn't sound like a jazz club or a soft soul record. This feels like a hot city street, cars honking, people arguing, radios blasting, sweat in the air. It's loud, rough, messy, and it keeps going like the night never sleeps. On the Corner came out in 1972, released on Columbia Records, produced by Teo Matero, with Miles deep in his electric era. Miles was trying to mix funk, jazz, street rhythms, and black urban life, inspired by James Brown, Sly Stone, and the sound of young black people outside, not fancy concert halls. There are almost no normal melodies, no clear verses, no sweet singing, just loops, grooves, and tension. When it dropped, critics hated it, radio ignored it, and many jazz fans felt Miles had lost his mind. Fun fact, some of these tracks were built from long jam sessions, then chopped and rearranged in the studio like a puzzle. That editing style later became normal in hip-hop and electronic music, but back then, people weren't ready. Why it was called bad, and why it's still argument fuel. In the 1970s, this album felt too black, too street, too noisy for jazz fans, and too weird for soul fans. There were no hits, no love songs, no easy way in. Real heads keep this one like a secret key because once it clicks, you realize Miles was talking to the future, not the charts. Remember earlier when I said one album on this list would start real arguments? Yeah, this is the one. Some people say On the Corner was Miles selling out, chasing funk and street culture to stay relevant. In interviews and later writings, Miles said the opposite. He felt jazz had turned its back on young black listeners. And he wanted his music back where the people were. There are different versions of the story, but the truth sits in the middle. Record labels wanted sales, critics wanted tradition, and Miles wanted freedom. Because radio didn't support it and critics slammed it, the album was pushed to the side. But years later, DJs, hip-hop producers, and crate diggers started calling it ahead of its time. That's why this album isn't just music, it's history. And keep listening, because number 3 takes us even deeper into the moment when soul, funk, and ego all collided, and nothing came out clean.
But this fool got wise. I remember a man I used to love.
Number 3, Honeycomb, The Day I Found Myself. This one feels like sunshine trying real hard to hide the clouds. Picture a clean living room in 1972, radio low, mom's ironing, kids running around, sweet harmonies floating through the air. It sounds happy, polite, and smooth, but it never really cuts deep. Love, Peace, and Soul came out in 1972 on Hot Wax Records, produced mainly by General Johnson, of chairman of the board. Honeycomb were already hitmakers, known for bright, catchy soul about love, confidence, and everyday wins, not heavy pain or politics. The album leaned into that same formula, tight harmonies, upbeat grooves, clean lyrics, but by 1972, soul music was changing fast. While Curtis Mayfield, Marvin Gaye, and Stevie Wonder were digging into real-life struggles, this album stayed light, safe, and smiling. It charted modestly, but it didn't leave a long shadow. No big cultural moment, no major samples, no deep album cuts people argue about today. Fun fact, Honeycomb were one of the first all-female groups to have multiple number 1 R&B hits in the early 70s. That history is bigger than this album, and that's part of the problem. Why it's forgotten / why it gets called bad. The album faded because it got caught between eras. It wasn't raw enough for the new message soul, and it wasn't bold enough to stand out as pure pop either. When people talk about Honeycomb today, they talk about the hits, not this album. Real heads respect the group, but they don't reach for this record first. And stay right here, because number 2 is where a true legend drops an album so confusing, fans are still arguing about it today. Number 2, Shalimar, Uptown Festival. Picture a packed roller rink in '77, lights flashing, DJ yelling, everybody moving at once. The music doesn't breathe, it rushes, like 5 songs stitched together with no time to feel nothing. It's fun for 10 minutes, but sit with it too long and you start asking, where's the soul? Uptown Festival came out in 1977, tied closely to the Soul Train world and the early vision of Dick Griffey, before Shalimar became a fully locked-in vocal group. The album's big idea was a disco medley, fast blends of old soul and funk classics made for dancing, not storytelling. The lyrics don't dig into struggle or deep love. They're about party time, movement, and nostalgia, like flipping radio stations real fast. The title track got club play and some chart attention, but the album itself never became a must-own R&B LP. It was more of a moment record than a legacy one. Fun fact, Shalimar didn't even start as a real band in the usual way. Early versions of the group were pulled from soul-trained dancers, not singers who grew up together. That's why this album feels more like a dance project than a soul group finding its voice. Why it's forgotten / why it's called Bad. This album faded because once disco cooled down, there wasn't much emotional weight left to hold on to. When Shalimar later dropped albums like Big Fun with real songs and a real lineup, Uptown Festival instantly sounded like practice tapes for a better future. Real heads don't replay this for feelings. They study it like a blueprint that led to something stronger later. Remember earlier when I teased that one album on this list would shock you because of what happened behind the scenes? This is that moment. Some people say Uptown Festival shows what happens when image comes before identity. In interviews and retrospectives, it's been said that Shalimar was constructed first as a TV-friendly act, not a band that grew together in studios, churches, or clubs. There are different versions of the story, but the common truth is this: the music came second to the concept. This wasn't about bad intentions. It was industry politics, TV exposure, fast money, disco fever, and labels wanting something they could sell right now. But that rush meant the album didn't build a deep bond with listeners. When lineups changed and Shalimar later became a real vocal force, this early album was quietly left behind, rarely reissued, rarely defended, almost erased. And that's why Uptown Festival isn't just a weak R&B album. It's a lesson, a reminder that soul music can't be rushed, packaged, or stitched together. Controversy. Pay off. Final reveal. Remember earlier when I teased that number one wasn't about bad singing or bad playing? This is that moment. Some people say Something to Love is what happens when the industry starts steering the wheel. In interviews and retrospectives, artists from this era often talk about label pressure. Smooth it out, make it radio, don't scare the crossover crowd. There are different versions of the story, but the feeling is the same: Polish over passion. The context matters. In the late 70s, labels had real power, radio formats were tightening, disco dollars were loud, and bands that could really play were sometimes asked to tone it down. No bands, no scandals, just a quiet squeeze. And that's how it affected LTD's legacy. This album didn't get pushed underground. It got pushed aside. The mystique never formed, the danger never showed up, and history moved on. That's why this record isn't just music.
In the name of love, before you break my...
It's a snapshot of a moment when soul was told to behave. Stay right here, because number one isn't just a bad album. It's the one with the biggest controversy, expectations, and disappointment of the whole list.
I'm face to face.
Number one, LTD, Something to Love. Picture you and me in 77, radio on low, city lights sliding past the windshield. The groove is smooth, the vocals are sweet, and everything sounds nice. Maybe too nice. It's the kind of record that plays in the background while life happens, but it doesn't always grab your chest and stop you. This album dropped in 1977 on A&M Records, with production led by Bobby Martin and the band themselves. The title track, Something to Love, is a tender love song, soft pleas, smooth harmonies, everyday romance, with a clean, radio-ready sound. Commercially, the single did well and helped keep LTD visible on R&B radio, but the album as a whole didn't hit with the same weight as their strongest moments. In a year when soul was getting deeper or funkier, this record sat right in the middle, polished, safe, and built for crossover. Fun fact, many fans discovered LTD backwards. They fell in love with earlier or later songs first, then went back to this album and said, "Oh, this is calmer than I expected." That surprise is part of its story. Why it's forgotten / why it ends up here. Here's the truth spoken with love. Something to Love gets called bad, not because it's ugly, but because it feels careful. No big risks, no wild moments, and when soul music is playing it safe, it can fade fast. As disco rose and R&B split into harder funk and deeper ballads, this album got overshadowed, not hated, just quietly left behind. Real heads don't diss it. They just don't reach for it first. And before you judge the whole list, listen close, because the story behind why this album played it safe is where the real lesson lives.